Hello Internet, I'm Stravos11, and today we're going to be taking a look at the latest post from the Blackrock Mountain adventure, The Horrors of the Hidden Laboratory. Dragons. First off, we have Drakonid Crusher. It is a 6 mana neutral minion, it is a dragon, has 6/6 stats, and it reads, Battle Cry, if your opponent has 15 or less health, gain +3/+3. Now, this card is, I think, meant to be just a solid mid-rangey dragon to have in your deck to synergize with the dragon holding mechanic. Which I think it does okay, but I think there's probably better choices, especially the next card we'll be taking a look at. As far as the stats go, it's okay, it's average, solid creature. Compared to Boulder Fist Ogre, it's a little bit worse, unless the effect hits. If you're gonna play it in an aggro deck, yes, maybe by turn 6 you might have your opponent down to 15 or less health. The problem is, this card just doesn't fit in an aggro deck, and you really want to give your opponent a target for his BGH. What about control decks? I think this might struggle to find its place in control decks too. Temple Enforcer, a priest card that's also a 6/6 for 6 with a pretty big upside, is not really ever getting played in constructed. So this card, if it gets played, it's probably gonna get played because it's a dragon. But I would argue in this case too, there's probably better options to put in your deck. So I'm going to put it as a 5 out of 11. Again, it's not terrible, it's okay, but it's pretty mediocre. As far as arena goes, this is a pretty okay card. I would say it's a little bit better, and I would say that in arena, yeah, sometimes you might just get your opponent low, either because he didn't have a good opening play, or maybe just because the game dragged on for a long time, and this card will be a 9/9 and your opponent might have a really tough time dealing with it, right? It's kind of like a much better Anima Golem. So in arena I would rate it as a 7. This card is about on par with Boulder Fist Ogre, and it can be much better in the right circumstances. As far as style points go, I think the description says it pretty well. He's a dragonkin, he crushes things. What more do you want? 3 out of 11. The card doesn't impress me too much. The effect is kind of weird and it's kind of just vanilla. Next up we have Volcanic Drake. It is a 6 mana neutral minion, it is a dragon, it has 6/4 stats, and it reads costs 1 less for each minion that died this turn. Okay, this is another time we see this mechanic. We've seen it with that crappy mage spell. This time it is a minion though, and it is a dragon, which I think is the key in a lot of decks. I think a lot of decks will want some dragon that's pretty big but not quite as big as something like Alexstrasza or Malygos and the like. So I think this card fits that role pretty well because it's very flexible and it kind of synergizes in a way with the holding mechanic. I think it can be really good, obviously, if you can get it for like 0 or 1 mana, but on the other hand, if you top deck it or if you just play it and it just trades with a shredder, it's not that impressive, is it? What do you actually take out to put this card in? I think that is the weirdest question here, because you would think, well, I would just take out a 6-drop, right? Well, this isn't really a 6-drop. Maybe you would take out a pretty solid minion like Sludge Belcher or a Yeti if you have one, but it's weird. Yetis and Sludge Belchers fulfill a pretty specific role in the sense that you just kind of plop them down. It doesn't hurt to just play a Yeti or play a Sludge Belcher, right? It's always okay. You can't really just play this card. You have to have kind of a specific scenario happening. Now, how specific is that scenario for this card to actually be good? 6 mana, it sucks. The stats are terrible. 5 mana, the stats are also pretty bad. 4 mana, I think this is pretty reliable. I think you'll oftentimes just have a creature on your board and a creature on your opponent's board, and just trade and play this for 4 mana. Now for 4 mana I think it's borderline okay. 6/4 stats is 10 for 4 mana total stats, so it's not bad, but I would argue that a Yeti is actually just a little bit better in most situations. This card is pretty easy to kill. A 3 mana 6/4 is amazing, and a 0 to 2 mana 6/4 is unbelievably good. So I think this card might find its way even in decks that are not actually dragon decks. Paladins, for example, with their 1/1s, they can get this to a pretty reasonable mana cost pretty easily. Also, Warlocks with their imps might find this card pretty appealing. It's kind of hard to compare it to any specific card. You might compare it to Sea Giant. Sea Giant, if you have a lot of minions on your board, you can play it for a really low cost, and it's a really big creature. In the same sense, if you have a lot of minions on the board, there'll be a lot of minions to trade, and this card will also be played for really low mana. However, Sea Giant is a much more durable card than this, but it's also vulnerable to BGH. So yeah, it's really tough to decide, but I think this card can work well in a lot of decks. Just a lot of Zooey type decks might fit this in. Just spawn a bunch of imps, trade them in, play a 6/4. Pretty good, right? Your opponent has a lot of stuff, Flame Strike, play a 6/4. You need a dragon in your deck, you have this in your hand. I don't know just how good it'll be by itself in any of these decks, but there has to be decks that make use of this card. It gets an 8 in Constructed. This was, I think, by far the hardest for me to decide on one way or the other how good this card is. Now as far as Arena goes, I think pretty much all I've said for Constructed applies pretty much just as well in this case. It's also an 8 out of 11. Yeah, in Arena it might be harder to pull off, because if you're behind and you can't deal with your opponent's creatures, this thing will be a lot harder to justify. But if you're ahead, you can get really ahead by having this card in your deck. Also, if you're a mage, you can get pretty ahead by having this card in your deck and a Flame Strike, right? As far as style points go, this is a very interesting card. I would also give it around an 8. This effect on a creature is very interesting. However, the card itself, a Volcanic Drake, it's okay, but it looks kind of boring, honestly. And last off, we have the man himself, Nefarian. It is a 9 mana legendary neutral minion. It has 8/8 stats. It is of course a dragon, and it reads Battle Cry. Add 2 random spells to your hand from your opponent's class. Now that's a dragon for you. Okay, so how good is Nefarian? 8/8 stats for 9 mana is bad. Now, not only does it die to BGH, obviously, god, I'm so getting tired of saying that, but also it's below average, and compared to Ysera and Malygos, who have 4/12, I would say Nefarian gets the short end of the stick, as well as Alexstrasza. But Alexstrasza is getting played in a few decks. And why is that exactly? Well, I would argue that it's because it does something immediate the turn you play it, and it's something very significant. It's often a win condition in something like Freeze Mage, or it's a not die condition in something like Warrior. Well, Nefarian doesn't really do something the turn he's played. Technically he does, you get your cards in your hand, but you probably won't be able to use them until next turn. So it's a card that does really nothing the turn you play it, is vulnerable to BGH, and has a random effect. Now, there's a few things we can compare this with. First off, Thought Steal. Very similar effect, right? You draw 2 cards randomly from your opponent's deck. Now, a lot of people don't like Thought Steal because you can draw completely useless stuff, like Deadly Poison, like Shield Slam, like Tinker's Oil. You notice something about all of those cards? Yeah, they're all spells, actually. You know what other cards are also spells? Totemic Might. Savagery. Yeah. No, not really. See, yes, with Thoughtsteal you can get some pretty crappy things, but if your opponent has a good deck, you're likely to get good stuff. You also have a possibility of drawing stuff like Ragnaros and Ysera, right? Speaking of Ysera, how does that compare to this card? I would say that in most situations Ysera is just pretty much better, because it just has better stats, and all of those cards are pretty damn good. Now Nefarian draws 2 cards, and yes, it can be that you get Flame Strike and you clear your opponent's board if you're playing a mage. It can be that you get Hex from a Shaman, that is possible, but you can also get Totemic Might. Twice. So I think it's kind of unreliable and it's a little bit too slow. On the other hand, it does give you free cards, and free cards are pretty good. Neptulon's effect is a pretty good effect, though Neptulon I would argue is played because 1, you can play it way earlier, 2, it doesn't necessarily use up your whole turn, and it has better stats for its mana cost, although it also has the overload. So all in all, Nefarian is not that great of a card. I think it is actually playable, but it is in a really slow meta, and who knows, we might get a really slow meta and you might see this card getting played. I would give it a 4 out of 11 in Constructed. Wouldn't you rather maybe even have an Onyxia, his sister? I mean, I think I would rather have some whelps on the field that risk getting a really crappy spell in my hand. As far as Arena goes, this card is significantly better, especially since your opponent is likely to be a mage or a paladin who generally have very good spells, and it's a big minion, and if you haven't died yet by turn 9, this might win you the game single-handedly if it gets good stuff. All in all, in Arena, it is a 8 out of 11 in my opinion. As far as style points go, I would give him a 7 out of 11. You're probably thinking, why only a 7? He's a really cool card, right? It's a pretty interesting effect. It is, but I am growing increasingly more tired of cards with random in their title to this extent. It's not that bad compared to something like a Shredder or a Unstable Portal, but still, there's so much variance here. You can get something that doesn't do anything and just essentially loses you the game, or you can get something that completely wins the game out of absolutely nowhere. But it's gonna be a pretty cool thing to see nonetheless. Alright guys, if you enjoyed this video, consider liking, subscribing, following on Twitch and Twitter and all that stuff. I'll make more of these videos in the future. Hopefully you'll tune in. Bye bye.